It begins with a silence so heavy that even the wind seems reluctant to pass through the rusted gates of Ravenswood Public School. At this hour, just a little after midnight, the rural valley is swallowed in darkness, its tall pine trees bowed like mourners standing vigil. Yet within that silence rests a question that has left investigators sleepless, parents terrified, and an entire district unable to understand how a school full of life just hours earlier could become an abandoned shell overnight. The camera pans across the empty playground, swings swaying gently though there is no breeze strong enough to move them. Chalk dust drifts across the concrete as if disturbed by invisible hands. A child's backpack lies unzipped beside the slide, its contents scattered the way someone might drop everything while fleeing. The school building itself stands like a wounded giant, lights flickering from tall, rectangular windows, illuminating glimpses of overturned chairs and open lockers. Everything looks exactly as it was left, because no one had time to gather their belongings. Police tape wraps the entrance in crisscross patterns, the yellow ribbons fluttering like warnings against something more than trespassing. Officers stand guard, not out of necessity, no one dares approach, but because protocol demands it. Even from a distance, they keep glancing at the glass panels of the main hallway, unsure whether they truly saw movement inside or if exhaustion is playing tricks. Earlier that evening, frantic calls had flooded emergency lines. Parents screaming. Teachers begging for help. Dozens of students collapsing, shaking violently, some unable to speak. And the most disturbing detail, every single one of them describing the same vision, down to the same final moment when they felt someone, or something, standing directly behind them. But when first responders arrived, the building was silent. No sign of chaos. No intruder. Just the lingering echo of fear. As investigators moved deeper inside the school, they found notebooks abandoned mid-sentence, chairs toppled as if kicked backward by instinct, and hallways littered with fallen phones still recording. A scattered math assignment lay near a classroom door, the corner stained where a student had dropped it during the panic. In another room, desks were arranged neatly, except for one, facing the wrong direction, as if the student seated there had turned suddenly to look behind them. What unsettled investigators the most wasn't what happened, but the fact that no one could explain how it spread so rapidly. Teachers reported seeing their students stiffen in unison, their eyes darting to empty corners, pupils dilating as though witnessing something impossible. It wasn't hysteria. It was synchronized. Instantaneous. Like a single thought injected into dozens of minds at once. Hours later, when students regained partial consciousness, they were unable to recall what triggered their terror. But they remembered the vision. Every one of them. The same figure. The same faceless outline. The same whisper echoing inside their heads, in a voice none of them recognized. As the forensic team worked inside the art room, they made the discovery that forced authorities to close the school indefinitely. On each desk, left behind by trembling hands, were drawings created moments before the panic. Some were neat sketches, others frantic scribbles. But all showed the same towering figure, a silhouette with no facial features, standing in the doorway of their classroom. And then there was the chalkboard. Drawn boldly across it was a tall shape, its head brushing the top edge, its limbs disproportionate, almost stretched. Underneath, written in shaky handwriting, were 3 words, "It saw us." Even more disturbing was how investigators found the phrase repeated around the school, in hallways, on torn notebook pages, scratched faintly onto a bathroom stall, and once, chillingly, traced into the condensation on a window that no one had touched. The final blow came when one officer, reviewing the scattered sketches under a portable light, whispered, "These drawings, they match a report from 15 years ago. The same figure. The same shape. The same, everything." But the school district had no record of such an incident. No file. No warnings. No archived notes. Which raised a question no one wanted to voice: if this had happened before, who tried to bury the evidence? As the section closes, the camera zooms out from the flickering hallway lights, revealing dozens of identical drawings lying across the floor like silent witnesses. Something had entered the school that day. Something every student saw. Something that should not have been there. But the most haunting part? Whatever they saw, it might not have stayed behind. The morning before everything collapsed began like any other at Ravenswood Public School, cold air hanging low over the valley, the sky painted in muted tones of gray-blue, and the faint sound of bicycle wheels and morning chatter drifting toward the building. Nothing about that sunrise hinted that within 24 hours, the school would stand empty, sealed off, and feared. Students filtered through the gates, some yawning, others whispering about upcoming exams or weekend plans. The staff greeted them with the usual combination of routine warmth and early morning exhaustion. Yet if one looked closely, really closely, there were subtle signs that something inside the school was already shifting, though no one recognized them for what they truly were. Inside the main hallway, the lights flickered with a faint electrical buzz, dimming for a fraction of a second every time a group of students walked past. The janitor, Mr. Adler, paused beneath one of the flickering bulbs, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not again," he muttered. "We just replaced this wiring last semester." He would later insist that he felt a momentary drop in temperature each time the light dimmed, as if someone unseen walked through him. At that moment, though, he simply tightened his grip on his mop and continued his rounds. In classroom 3B, Lena Matthews, a quiet but perceptive 12-year-old who often sketched in the corners of her notebooks, sat at her desk early. She stared out the window toward the old trees behind the school, her pencil tapping lightly. She told her friend later that she had the strangest sensation, as though someone was already waiting for her inside the building, though the halls were nearly empty when she arrived. Elsewhere, Evan Porter, a mischievous 8th grader known for pranks, teased his classmates while balancing his skateboard in the hallway. "This school's haunted anyway," he laughed, pointing to the old basement door near the library, a door sealed shut decades ago. The other kids rolled their eyes, but one student swore she heard tapping coming from behind it. Soft, rhythmic. As if someone inside was knocking. The teachers were busy with their own concerns. In the staff room, Miss Callahan, the English teacher, massaged her temples. She'd been suffering from an intense, persistent migraine since dawn, one she described as a pressure behind the eyes, like someone whispering right against my skull. The school nurse attributed it to stress and suggested rest, but Ms. Callahan insisted on teaching her classes. Her students later reported she seemed distracted, glancing repeatedly at the corners of the room as though expecting someone to be standing there. Meanwhile, Principal Donald Reeves, a tall man with a reputation for strict discipline, held a meeting with 2 board members regarding budget cuts. He appeared stern as always, but an undercurrent of anxiety surfaced in his voice. Some staff said he'd been unusually tense in the days leading up to the incident, pacing the hallways during recess, stopping mid-stride as though listening to something others could not hear. That morning, he paused at the trophy case outside the main office, staring at his own reflection until someone called his name. When he turned, he muttered, "Thought someone was behind me." By mid-morning, the school appeared to settle into its usual rhythm, yet the illusion of normalcy was fragile. In the science wing, an entire row of classroom clocks malfunctioned simultaneously, freezing at 10:14 a.m. for exactly 90 seconds before resuming. Students noticed. Teachers dismissed it. But something about the synchronized malfunction left an unsettling quiet in its wake. Then came the first real sign. In classroom 2A, a group of younger students began whispering about a strange shadow they saw near the back of the room. It was tall, one insisted. Like a grown-up but not a teacher. Another swore the shadow had no face. Their teacher, assuming it was imagination, simply closed the blinds. But moments after she turned away, a cold shiver passed through the entire class at once, like a wave rippling through a pool of still water. At lunchtime, the cafeteria buzzed with conversation, but slightly more subdued than usual. Some students kept glancing at the far door, unsure why they felt watched. Others reported hearing faint footsteps behind them, but when they turned around, no one was there. And in the corner near the vending machine, Lena sat hunched over her notebook, drawing something she couldn't explain. It resembled a tall silhouette, the same shape found later in nearly every student's sketch, though at this time, she had no memory of having seen it. Outside, clouds thickened overhead as if mirroring the tension inside the school. A teacher supervising recess reported that the temperature dropped suddenly, sharply, for less than a minute. Enough to make every student gasp. Enough to make breath visible. Enough for one little boy to start crying, insisting he felt a cold hand brush his shoulder. As the day moved toward its final class periods, the school's CCTV system recorded its first anomaly. At 3:02 p.m., footage from hallway 4A glitched, distorting the image into streaks of static. When the frame stabilized, a single figure appeared at the far end, tall, unmoving, facing the camera. But according to attendance logs, the hallway had been empty at that exact moment. Seconds later, the figure vanished between frames. Gone without movement. Gone without explanation. No one noticed the anomaly until hours later, long after the school had been shut down. But in that moment, as students packed their bags and teachers prepared to head home, the shadowy image lingered unseen inside the school's digital memory like a silent warning. The day had begun normally. But by its final bell, something had already entered the building. And tomorrow, it would reveal itself to everyone inside. The first ripple of fear inside Ravenswood Public School began shortly after the lunch break, small enough to dismiss, yet strange enough that several staff members remembered it vividly afterward. It started in the nurse's office, a quiet corner of the school where children typically arrived with scraped knees, stomach aches, or carefully rehearsed excuses to avoid quizzes. But that afternoon, the atmosphere inside the nurse's room shifted into something unnaturally heavy. The school nurse, Helen Morris, was tending to paperwork when Sophie Layton, a shy 7th grader, walked in trembling. Sophie wasn't the type to exaggerate. She was soft-spoken, studious, always trying her best to stay invisible. Yet now, she clutched the edges of her sleeves so tightly her knuckles turned white. "My head hurts," she whispered. Helen reached for a thermometer, but stopped when she saw the girl's eyes. Dilated. Unfocused. As if locked onto something behind Helen rather than the woman in front of her. "Did you hit your head?" the nurse asked gently. "No, someone was watching me," Sophie said. "Who?" Sophie's lips parted, but she hesitated. "I don't know. It wasn't a person. I think." Before Helen could ask more, another student appeared in the doorway, Marcus Hill, a confident 8th grader known for his athletic talent. But now, his swagger was gone. He looked pale, jumpy, constantly checking over his shoulder. "Can I stay here for a bit?" he asked. I felt weird. 2 students. 2 unconnected classes. Both claiming they felt watched. Helen scribbled notes, concerned but cautious. Ravenswood students occasionally exaggerated things, the school's old architecture and dim hallways lent themselves to ghost stories. Yet something about Marcus and Sophie's identical expressions, the same mix of confusion and terror, made her stomach knot. Minutes later, she escorted Marcus to the waiting cot. He sat stiffly, staring forward. "I saw someone," he muttered. "Tall, standing by the lockers. But when I blinked, gone." Helen finished for him. He nodded. Helen checked the hallway through the small window. Empty. But her skin prickled anyway. Meanwhile, in classroom 3B, Lena Matthews, the girl who had been sketching earlier, left for a bathroom break. When she returned, she found a page on her desk that didn't belong to her. The drawing on it was rough but unmistakable, the same elongated silhouette she had unconsciously sketched that morning. Only this version had an added detail, long, stretched fingers reaching toward a desk. Her desk. When she asked her classmates who placed it there, no one admitted to it. Some swore they hadn't gone near her seat. Others avoided eye contact. But one boy whispered, "I saw something move near your desk when you left. I thought it was just shadows." Lena tried to laugh it off, but the image haunted her. She folded the drawing, but the paper shook between her fingers. Elsewhere in the school, subtle disturbances began to spread. In the library, books fell from a shelf in a tidy row, not scattered, not thrown, but placed gently on the ground as if chosen intentionally. The librarian, Mr. Lewis, blamed vibrations, though the shelf didn't wobble when he tested it. He didn't notice the pattern of dust on the floor, as if a figure had stood there for some time. In the art room, a jar of paintbrushes tipped over without anyone touching it. Students gasped as the brushes rolled across the table forming a circle. Their teacher chalked it up to an accident, though her hands visibly shook. Even the birds outside the classroom windows seemed unnerved, tapping repeatedly against the glass as if trying to warn the children inside. By early afternoon, the tension inside the school became difficult to ignore. At 1:47 p.m., the fire alarm abruptly blared, a sharp, piercing shriek that sent students scrambling. But when teachers checked the control panel, they found no indication of smoke, heat, or manual activation. The alarm had simply triggered itself. As evacuation began, several students in different parts of the building collapsed almost simultaneously. Sophie in the nurse's office. A second grader in the hallway. 3 eighth graders near the cafeteria doors. 2 boys helping a teacher herd students outside. They all fell the same way, backs arched, arms rigid, eyes wide but unfocused. Some whispered something under their breath. Others gasped as though struggling to breathe. Parents later described this moment as the point where normal explanations failed. Because the students didn't faint from exhaustion. They didn't trip. They didn't suffer panic attacks. Their bodies reacted as if they had all seen the same thing at the same time, something that overwhelmed their senses instantly. Nurse Helen knelt beside Sophie, tapping her cheek gently. "Sophie. Can you hear me?" The girl's lips trembled before she spoke, voice barely audible. "It's in the hallway." "What is?" "The tall one." Helen froze. Marcus, lying on the adjacent cot, echoed the same word seconds later, "The tall one, it followed us." None of the children described a face. None described clothing. None offered a human explanation. Just height. Presence. And watching. Always watching. By the time the false alarm was resolved and students were escorted back inside, teachers were shaken. Some chalked it up to coincidence. Others feared a gas leak or environmental contamination. But what unnerved them most was the consistency. Every frightened child described the same figure. Not similar. Not vaguely matching. Identical. And though the fire alarm was dismissed as a technical malfunction, the timing, aligned precisely with the students' collapses, suggested something else entirely. A trigger. A wave. Something spreading. That evening, when administrators reviewed the school's camera logs for safety compliance, they found the glitch from hallway 4A. The tall shadow appearing in the frames. The unnatural stillness of the figure. And the moment it vanished without motion. The staff gathered around the monitor, exchanging confused, fearful looks. "Who is that?" someone asked. But Principal Reeves said nothing. He simply stared at the screen, jaw clenched, as if recognizing something he hoped never to see again. Later that night, the district would receive its first urgent report describing the unfolding situation at Ravenswood. And by the following morning, they would understand, this wasn't random. This wasn't hysteria. It was the beginning of a pattern. A pattern of fear repeating itself through everyone who crossed the school's threshold. And the figure at the center of it all, was only getting started. The first detailed account of the shared vision came from a student who had not yet fully regained consciousness. 12-year-old Lena Matthews lay on a hospital bed, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, fingers twitching as if grasping at something in her dreams. Doctors believed she was still disoriented, trapped between sleep and waking. But when she whispered the first fragmented description, everyone in the room froze. It was, inside the classroom, she murmured. Tall, and it knew our names. The doctors exchanged quiet glances, assuming it was a panic-induced hallucination. Yet as more students awoke, some in the hospital, others at home, their stories aligned with chilling precision. Different ages, different classrooms, different personalities, different levels of suggestion, yet the same vision emerged as though choreographed by an unseen force. The vision began with a shift in the air, an unnatural stillness that hushed the sound around them. Many students later described it in metaphors, like someone turned off the world, like the classroom fell underwater, like my heart forgot to beat for a second. Within that silence, a coldness crept across the room, starting from the floor and rising slowly until it wrapped around their chests. They felt their chairs vibrating faintly, not shaking, but resonating, as though something enormous was moving beneath the floorboards. Then the light dimmed. Not a gradual fade, not a flicker. Instead, the brightness drained out of the world, swallowing colors whole until the classroom stood washed in a dusky gray. Every student reported the same thing: they could still see clearly, but the light felt wrong, as if it came from no source at all. Shadows elongated in unnatural directions, stretching toward the center of the room. That was when they first sensed the figure. None of them saw it appear. It did not walk in. It did not enter from the hallway. One moment, the room was empty. The next, something was simply there, standing in a corner, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Some students described its shape as a long silhouette. Others said it looked like a shadow that forgot how to act like a shadow. But the most frightening detail was its face. It had none. Just a featureless expanse, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. And yet, every student insisted they felt it watching them. Not metaphorically, not emotionally. They felt a physical sensation, as if unseen eyes locked onto their movements and tracked them with predatory patience. Several students said they tried to scream but found their throats frozen. A few managed to stand, but their legs buckled beneath them as though the air had turned too heavy to bear their weight. They couldn't run. They couldn't speak. They could only watch. The figure didn't move at first. It simply observed, expressionless and silent. One girl said she felt her heart beating so loudly she thought the figure could hear it. Another recalled clutching the desk so tightly her nails splintered. But the vision didn't end there. The figure whispered. Many students described the voice as a whisper inside my skull, a sound that did not enter through their ears but seemed to bypass physical reality entirely. Others said it felt like a vibration rippling through their bones. The words were unfamiliar, harsh, rhythmic syllables echoing a language none of them had ever heard. But every student repeated the same phrase phonetically afterward, each one identical in pronunciation. This was the detail that later shocked investigators: the children did not just share a hallucination, they shared a linguistic structure beyond their knowledge. Something old. Something buried. As the whispering continued, the classroom around them changed. Students described the world dissolving into darkness, walls evaporating, desks vanishing, the ceiling melting upward like rising smoke. Suddenly, they were no longer in the school. Instead, they stood in a vast, empty expanse, the floor made of cracked earth stretching endlessly in all directions. The air tasted like metal. The sky above was a swirling void, black, yet shifting with faint, crimson pulses like dying embers buried beneath ash. In that void, they saw something even more horrifying: their own bodies. Some described seeing themselves sitting at desks, frozen stiff. Others saw themselves lying on the ground, eyes open but lifeless. A few saw their reflections standing beside the tall figure, though those reflections looked older, distorted, or somehow wrong. Each student experienced the details slightly differently, but the core image remained consistent. They were witnessing their own absence from their bodies. Lena later recounted the moment with tears streaming down her face. "I saw myself, and I wasn't breathing. I could see dust settling on me. Like I'd been gone for a long time." Another student said he saw his reflection staring back at him with a smile that didn't belong to him. "Its eyes weren't mine," he whispered hoarsely. "But they were in my face." As the vision continued to unfold, the figure stepped closer, not walking, but gliding, its limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy. Each student reported hearing a second whisper then, softer than the first, spoken directly into one ear, "Look behind you." Most were too afraid to obey. But those who did saw something they described only as the true shape of the darkness. Some said they glimpsed dozens of pale hands reaching up from the cracked earth. Others saw a silhouette standing in the distance, smaller ones, child-sized, their heads tilted as if listening. A few saw faces forming out of the swirling void above them, faces contorted in silent screams. Then the vision shifted again. Without warning, each student saw the school, not as it was in the present, but in some past version. The paint on the walls peeled. The floors were cracked and stained. Desks were arranged in unfamiliar patterns. And in every classroom, they saw children they did not recognize, thin, sickly, staring ahead with hollow eyes. The faceless figure stood among them like a sentinel. One older student swore he saw a young boy sitting alone in a corner, whispering the same ancient phrase the figure had spoken moments ago. When he reached out to him in the vision, the boy looked up, revealing a face drained of color, mouth stretched into a silent plea, "It's still here." Another girl described seeing the school engulfed in fire, not flames, but ghostly embers drifting upward, as though the building were burning in a different dimension entirely. Through the smoke, she saw outlines of children running, their movements fragmented, their bodies flickering in and out like corrupted footage. The figure's shadow expanded behind them all. Finally, as the vision reached its crescendo, every student heard the whisper again, louder, more urgent, echoing through the dark landscape, "Let me in." Some said the voice was begging. Others said it was commanding. But all agreed on the final moment, the figure reached toward them. Its elongated hand stretched across the darkness, fingers curling. Then, a blinding flash. A snap back to reality. A violent jolt. Students gasped, screamed, collapsed. Desks shook. Air rushed back into the room. Light returned in a harsh burst. And the figure was gone. But its presence remained behind like residue. Every student woke with the same memory. The same image. The same phrase repeating in their minds like a broken record. Investigators initially believed the children had shared a psychological event, a collective hallucination triggered by stress or environmental factors. But that explanation shattered when a linguistics expert reviewing the whispered phrase said softly, "This isn't random. This is an ancient regional dialect, extinct for over a century." And then he asked a question no one was prepared to answer: how did children with no exposure to this language pronounce it perfectly, as though someone taught them? The vision wasn't a hallucination. It was a message. And something was trying to make itself known. Long before Ravenswood Public School stood on its quiet patch of land, something else occupied the valley, something the current town residents rarely spoke of, and something the school district actively avoided documenting. The origins of the land were a whispered topic, always softened, always shortened, always brushed away. But after the visions began and students collapsed, investigators were forced to look where no one had dared to search in generations: the past. The breakthrough came not from police or local authorities but from an archivist named Eleanor Grayson, a meticulous historian with an uncanny ability to detect gaps in records. She was brought in to cross-reference property deeds, teacher rosters, old schematics, anything that could explain the school's sudden eruption of supernatural terror. But Eleanor found something odd right away: Ravenswood Public School's earliest documents were missing. Not misplaced. Not damaged. Removed. Whole decades of records from the early 1900s to 1950 simply didn't exist in the official archives. Curiosity gnawed at her. She expanded her search to county records, then to church logs, then to handwritten land surveys preserved by families who had lived in the valley for over a century. It was there, in a bundle of yellowed pages tied with twine, that she discovered something chilling. Before the school, there had been an orphanage on the same land, Hawthorne Home for Lost Children, established in the late 1800s. The more Eleanor read, the colder she felt. Hawthorne Home had closed abruptly after what documents referred to only as the plague of visions. There were no medical descriptions, no autopsies, no official cause. The surviving orphans were relocated, the staff dismissed or untraceable, and the building was demolished within weeks. The land was left untouched for decades afterward until Ravenswood Public School was built directly on top of the foundation. At first, investigators assumed visions referred to religious fantasies or children experiencing trauma. But the deeper Eleanor dug, the more disturbing the accounts became. Some pages described drawings found under the orphanage floorboards, drawings of a tall figure without a face. Others mentioned children waking in the night screaming that the watcher was standing at their beds. One entry, written by an unnamed caretaker, was nearly illegible from frantic handwriting. It comes when the lights dim. It comes when the room falls still. It takes shape in the corners. The children see it first. Another caretaker's letter, dated months before the orphanage closed, described a child repeating the same whispered phrase the modern students had heard. Eleanor felt her throat tighten as she traced the words, mirrored perfectly, syllable for syllable, despite being written more than a century earlier. This was no coincidence. The orphanage's final report noted that multiple children had collapsed during morning prayers, eyes open but unresponsive, whispering the same dialect investigators had identified in the present day. The document ended abruptly mid-sentence, as though someone had been interrupted, or silenced. But one detail haunted Eleanor more than anything, a crude architectural sketch included with the pages. It showed the orphanage's original blueprint, including a basement chamber beneath the main building, a chamber marked simply as holding room. That label alone raised eyebrows among investigators. Holding what? Children? Supplies? Something else? The blueprint's measurements aligned almost perfectly with the location beneath Ravenswood's library. Officials claimed Ravenswood School had no basement. The blueprint said otherwise. Driven by a mixture of fear and academic determination, Eleanor insisted they search the area. At first, administrators resisted, concerned about legal liability, potential hazards, and the growing panic among parents. But by then, so many unexplained events had occurred that ignoring the possibility felt more dangerous than investigating it. Late one evening, after hours of examining the library floor, the maintenance worker noticed a hollow resonance beneath one corner. The wood sounded different, thinner, almost echoing. When they removed the carpet and pried up a section of the floor, they uncovered a rusted metal latch. The air that escaped was ice cold, carrying with it a faint scent of damp earth and something older, like forgotten dust drifting up from a sealed crypt. Authorities opened the hatch. A staircase descended into darkness. When their flashlights flickered on, they revealed a room that looked untouched for more than a century. The walls were stone, cold and crumbling. The air felt heavy, thick, almost suffocating. But what struck everyone hardest were the drawings covering the walls, hundreds of them. Children's hands had once filled this space with crude charcoal sketches of the same faceless figure students had drawn during the incident. Some drawings showed the figure towering over children in their beds. Some showed it reaching through doorways. Some showed it in the classroom layouts of the orphanage. Some depicted it standing beside children who looked asleep, but whose faces were marked with hollow circles for eyes. And then there were the words, scratched repeatedly into the stone by small hands, "It saw us. It followed us. It knows our names." The same phrases found during the school's evacuation. On the floor, beneath a layer of dust and debris, they found objects left undisturbed for years: a broken wooden toy, a rusted locket, a child's shoe far too small to belong to anyone from modern times. But there was one discovery worse than all the rest. On the far wall, written in dark, faded strokes that looked suspiciously like dried soot or blood, was the same ancient phrase the students heard during their vision, the same whisper investigators had been struggling to translate. Someone had written it more than 100 years ago. Someone inside this room had heard the same voice. Eleanor stepped back, heart pounding, hands trembling. This wasn't an orphanage tragedy, she whispered. This was containment. One of the investigators turned toward her. What do you mean? She swallowed hard, staring at the expanse of drawings around her. They weren't trying to protect the children from something outside. They were trying to trap something inside this building. A silence fell over the group, thick, suffocating, unspoken. The realization washed over them slowly, chillingly: the visions at Ravenswood weren't new. They weren't random. They weren't accidental. They were a continuation. The same presence that haunted the children of Hawthorne Home had never left. It had been buried, covered, forgotten. Until the modern school awakened it again. And now, the drawing suggested it was stronger than before. The investigators ascended the stairs with dread gnawing at their stomachs. Above them, the school remained silent, unaware of the secret unearthed directly beneath its floors. A pattern was emerging, one no one had recognized before. Not until it was too late. In the days following the discovery of the hidden basement, the investigation into the Ravenswood incident began to unravel from the inside. What had started as a unified, methodical inquiry slowly fractured into competing theories, suspicions, and rising paranoia. Every new revelation contradicted the last. Every attempt to explain the events only deepened the mystery. And as fear spread through the staff and community, the pressure intensified until even the investigators themselves began questioning each other's motives. Detective Samuel Crane, who had been assigned to lead the case, found himself drowning in conflicting testimonies. At first, he wrote off the students' accounts as mass hysteria, a psychological chain reaction brought on by stress, rumors, or environmental triggers. But the identical descriptions of the figure, the matching drawings, and now the undeniable evidence in the basement forced him to reconsider. He wasn't dealing with frightened children misinterpreting shadows. Something else was happening inside the school, something no one could explain using ordinary logic. Meanwhile, the teachers, once a cohesive staff, began turning on one another. Ms. Callahan insisted the electrical malfunctions were orchestrated by someone deliberately trying to scare the students. Mr. Lewis, the librarian, whispered that he had seen staff members acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the incident, disappearing into quiet hallways, staring at empty corners, speaking in hushed tones about things they claimed not to remember later. A rumor circulated that one teacher had been researching the orphanage's history long before the investigation began. Another rumor suggested the principal himself had known about the basement for years. These whispers fed into a growing suspicion that someone on the inside may have triggered the reawakening of whatever presence haunted the land. One night, while combing through security footage from a month earlier, Detective Crane noticed a pattern. A single staff member appeared repeatedly near restricted areas: the old library wing, the boiler room, and the sealed basement corner. It was Mr. Alden Pierce, a history teacher known for his fascination with local folklore. In each frame, Pierce wandered the hallways alone late at night, long after staff were expected to leave. He always kept his head down, and in several videos, he paused as though listening for something. When questioned, Pierce waved off the footage as harmless. "I was stressed," he said. "Walking helps me think." But Crane couldn't shake the feeling that Pierce was hiding something, especially when staff reported that he had recently checked out old archives that predated the school's construction. Among the files was a weathered folder labeled Hawthorne Home. Still, the investigation couldn't afford assumptions. Crane needed evidence. And evidence was becoming harder to trust as fear grew. Parents stormed the school district office demanding answers. They accused teachers of negligence, administrators of incompetence, and investigators of withholding the truth. The school board claimed the incident stemmed from a gas leak, despite zero environmental readings to support the theory. Officials were desperate to maintain control. The town was on the verge of panic. Inside the school, tension turned toxic. Teachers complained of nightmares, sleepless nights, and whispers echoing through empty classrooms. Some began refusing to enter certain hallways alone. Others avoided looking into reflective surfaces after several claimed they saw movement behind them that wasn't there. The janitor, Mr. Adler, walked off the job after hearing what he described as a child laughing inside the walls. Soon, the fracture in the investigation became undeniable. The scientific team believed the visions were linked to neuropsychological triggers, possibly something in the air or water that stimulated hallucinations. But they couldn't explain why the hallucinations were identical across dozens of students. The historians believed the cause was rooted in the land's dark past, the orphanage, the unexplained drawings, the symbolic language carved into the basement walls. But they couldn't explain why the phenomenon suddenly resurfaced now. The police believed someone intentionally caused the event, perhaps a staff member dabbling in something beyond their comprehension. But they couldn't explain how any human could orchestrate a mass hallucination with such precision. Each faction blamed the others. Meetings devolved into arguments. Progress stalled. And beneath it all, an unspoken fear festered: what if none of the theories were mutually exclusive? What if the land was cursed, the children were susceptible, and someone had awakened whatever lay dormant beneath the floorboards? The breaking point came when Miss Callahan, the teacher who had suffered migraines the day before the incident, went missing. Her car was found in the staff parking lot. Her keys remained in the ignition. Her bag sat on the passenger seat. But she was nowhere to be found. Her classroom was the only clue. On her desk lay a piece of paper. 3 words written in her handwriting: "It called me." No one wanted to believe it was true. No one wanted to consider the possibility that she hadn't simply left, that something had taken her. But the CCTV footage erased all doubt. At 9:14 p.m. the previous night, Ms. Callahan appeared in hallway 2C, walking slowly, almost sleepwalking. Her expression was blank. Her posture stiff. As she passed beneath a flickering light, she tilted her head as if listening to something just out of frame. Then she turned sharply and walked toward the library, toward the basement. Seconds later, the footage distorted. A shadow stretched across the wall behind her, tall, elongated, bending in a way no human shadow ever could. The outline hovered for a moment, then slipped out of frame as if melting into the darkness. When the feed stabilized, Ms. Callahan was gone. That discovery shattered the investigation entirely. Teachers burst into tears. Investigators argued whether the footage was altered. Parents demanded federal involvement. Principal Reeves locked himself in his office for hours. Crane felt the weight of something he couldn't articulate pressing against his sanity. And the staff, once united, no longer trusted one another. Each believed someone in the group knew more than they were saying. Some suspected Pierce. Others suspected Reeves. A few even suspected Crane. But no one suspected the truth. The figure wasn't targeting them randomly. It wasn't choosing victims from fear or proximity. It was following a pattern that began over a century ago in Hawthorne Home. And Ms. Callahan was only the beginning. The recovered CCTV footage became the most disturbing piece of evidence in the entire Ravenswood case, so disturbing, in fact, that several investigators refused to watch it a second time. What began as a routine attempt to retrieve corrupted files quickly turned into a horrifying revelation that shattered any lingering belief that the incident could be rationalized. No technical malfunction or tampered recording could explain what the cameras had captured. No human could replicate the movements, distortions, or impossible sequences that unfolded frame by frame. It started late in the evening, when a digital forensics technician named Daryl Hensley worked alone in the dimly lit classroom designated as the investigation's headquarters. The air smelled faintly of dust and old carpet, the only light coming from his monitor and a flickering hallway bulb outside the door. Daryl, exhausted and frustrated, had spent hours sifting through the corrupted camera files, most of which were unreadable blocks of static or fragmented images frozen at nonsensical timestamps. But then he found it. A video labeled CAM4A, 3 hours 12 minutes and 47 seconds suddenly restored itself with near-perfect clarity. At first, he assumed it was routine nighttime footage, just empty hallways, silent and still after the staff had left. But as the clip played, Daryl felt something tighten in his chest. The hallway was not empty. A faint movement flickered near the far end, too subtle to identify. He leaned closer to the screen, replaying the footage in slow motion. There it was again, a dark blur, forming the unmistakable outline of a tall figure standing completely still. No face, no details, just a silhouette darker than the shadows around it. The figure did not appear between frames. It did not walk into view. It simply materialized, as though it had been present the entire time but only decided to reveal itself when the camera resumed functioning. Daryl froze the frame. His breath hitched. He whispered to himself, "No, that's not possible." He zoomed in on the figure. Pixels warped around its body, bending unnaturally as though the air itself resisted its presence. At one point, the figure's outline flickered, not like a glitch, but like a shape shifting subtly, stretching in ways that defied the rules of physical form. The grain of the image deepened, thickened, contorting around the figure as though the camera struggled to process something it wasn't meant to capture. When Daryl played the footage further, the figure vanished, not by walking away, not by moving out of frame, but by collapsing into a narrow streak of darkness that dissolved entirely. It was as if the figure folded inward and disappeared. His skin crawled. His hands shook. He immediately summoned Detective Crane. Within minutes, the small classroom filled with investigators, all crowded around the monitor, their faces drawn, eyes fixed on the screen. Crane stood at the center, jaw clenched, listening intently to Daryl's explanation. Then they watched the clip again. No one spoke during the playback. No one dared breathe too loudly. But the horror didn't end there. When Daryl opened the next recovered file, CAM7B, everyone stiffened. This footage was from the night Ms. Callahan vanished. The first few seconds were uneventful, a quiet hallway, emergency lights casting long yellow bars across the floor. Then Ms. Callahan appeared, walking slowly, her movements stiff and mechanical. She didn't look up. She didn't look around. She moved as though guided by an unseen force. Her fingers twitched at her sides, and her expression remained eerily blank. Then the camera glitched. The screen stretched into a distorted ripple, and Ms. Callahan's figure elongated grotesquely for a split second before snapping back into shape. Some investigators gasped, others instinctively stepped back from the monitor. Crane's eyes narrowed. "Play that again." Daryl rewound the clip, but as he replayed the glitched moment, something else became visible, something they hadn't noticed the first time. Behind Ms. Callahan, a second shape began to form. At first, it resembled nothing more than a smudge of darkness trailing her footsteps. But as the footage stabilized, the shape grew taller, denser, more defined, stretching like a shadow cast by something that wasn't present in the hallway. It followed her closely, though no light source existed to cast such a shadow. And then, as Ms. Callahan paused near the library entrance, the shadow straightened. It took form. A towering figure with a blank face and elongated limbs hovered behind her. The air around its outline vibrated, distorting the pixels like heat waves rising off asphalt. But this was not warmth, it radiated cold. A suffocating cold that seemed to seep from the screen itself, filling the room with a creeping tightness that made several investigators shiver. One whispered, "Dear God," then something happened that defied every natural law governing camera systems. For one frame, just a single frame, the figure turned its head toward the camera. Despite having no face, no eyes, no features at all, every person in the room felt it looking directly at them. A piercing, suffocating awareness washed over them as if the figure recognized their presence. As if it understood it was being watched. As if it wanted them to know. The technician scrambled backward, knocking over a chair. Crane's breath hitched. The room fell silent except for the faint electrical buzz of the monitor. When Darrell advanced the footage, Miss Callahan continued walking, turning toward the library basement door. The tall figure followed her, gliding instead of stepping. It moved without motion, an eerie float that made the hallway lights flicker in sync. And then the footage froze. The next frames dissolved into pure static. When the camera feed returned seconds later, the hallway was empty. Ms. Callahan was gone. The shadow was gone. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably. Investigators exchanged uneasy glances. But the most horrifying discovery was still to come. As Darrell continued digging through corrupted files, he found a small clip recorded in a classroom minutes before the school was evacuated. The footage captured 28 students sitting at their desks, listening to their teacher. Then, all at once, every student froze. Not like children startled by a noise. Not like a natural pause. Their bodies stiffened simultaneously, heads lifting in the same direction, toward the corner of the room. Their eyes widened in perfect unison. For a full 8 seconds, none of them blinked. The silent, synchronized terror radiating from the children in the footage sent chills down the spines of the investigators. It was as though time itself had stopped for them. Then, as suddenly as they froze, they collapsed, some slipping from their chairs, others dropping their pencils, all of them falling at the exact same moment. The screen flickered. And for the briefest instant, a span shorter than a heartbeat, the faceless figure appeared in the corner of the frame, so close to the camera that its blank head filled the center of the screen. Then darkness. The classroom erupted into screams in real time. The footage ended there. Darrell turned to Crane with trembling hands. "These cameras didn't malfunction," he said. "They recorded exactly what was there." Crane exhaled slowly, his jaw tight, his expression hollow. "Then God help us," he whispered, "because something in that school was watching them long before we ever pressed play." In the days after the recovered footage shook the investigation to its core, an unsettling shift began to ripple outward, first quietly, then with alarming speed. What everyone had believed was contained within the walls of Ravenswood Public School began manifesting far beyond it. Parents who had rushed to bring their children home now found themselves facing symptoms eerily similar to the ones their kids had experienced. Investigators who spent long nights in the school began reporting strange dreams. And those who had reviewed the CCTV footage felt a presence lingering behind them long after leaving the building. The haunting was no longer bound to the school grounds. It was following anyone who had witnessed its story. Detective Crane was the first to show signs. At home, he barricaded his bedroom door every night after waking repeatedly to the sound of soft knocks echoing through the hallway. The knocks were always spaced evenly, 3 taps, a pause, then 3 again. At first, he assumed it was the house settling. But one night, when he pressed his ear against the door, he heard a faint whisper seep through the wood. A voice he recognized from the footage. Cold. Rhythmic. Ancient. It wasn't a word he understood, but the cadence was unmistakable. The same whisper from the children's visions. Crane snapped on the lights, weapon drawn, but the hallway remained empty. Only the shadows seemed to shift slightly, breathing in the corners. He slept the rest of the night with the lights on, unable to shake the feeling that something stood just outside his field of view. Meanwhile, one of the parents, Laura Brandt, called emergency services when her son woke in terror, claiming the tall figure had appeared at the foot of his bed. Laura tried comforting him, insisting it was just a nightmare, but when she reached to turn on the lamp, she felt a sudden blast of cold air brush past her face. Her breath turned visible. Her fingers numbed instantly. She dropped the lamp in shock. Her son, still trembling beneath the covers, whispered, "Mom, it whispered my name this time." Laura later admitted she felt a pressure behind her, like a presence leaning close, but she couldn't bring herself to turn around. Another parent reported that her daughter began sleepwalking for the first time in her life. The girl walked to the front door each time, unlocked it, and stood on the porch staring into the darkness. When asked what she was doing, she replied in a monotone voice, "Listening. It's calling from the trees." Worse still were the accounts from the investigation team itself. Linguist Dr. Howard Lorne, who had been studying the phrase heard in the visions, became increasingly paranoid. At first, his colleagues dismissed it as stress. But the signs grew too alarming to ignore. He started covering the mirrors in his home, claiming he saw movement behind him even when he stood alone. He stopped sleeping, convinced that the whispering he heard at night wasn't in his mind. When he finally contacted Crane, his voice was trembling, fractured. "I translated part of the phrase," he said. "It's not a statement. It's a plea." "What kind of plea?" Crane asked. Dr. Lorne swallowed hard over the phone. "It's asking for permission." Repeatedly. Like a ritual chant. Crane felt a chill work down his spine. "Permission for what?" "That's the part I'm not sure about," Lorne said. "But the children aren't hallucinating. The language is too precise. Too old. It's been waiting for centuries." He didn't finish the sentence. A loud crash sounded on his end of the line. Crane called for backup immediately, but by the time officers arrived, Lorne was found trembling in a corner of his office, staring at the wall. He was whispering the same phrase over and over again. His hands were ice cold. And on the wall behind him was something no one could explain, long streaks of soot-like residue forming the faint outline of a handprint. Not a human-sized one. Something larger. At the same time, a former student, one who had recovered quickly after the school evacuation, began experiencing severe episodes of dread. Her parents rushed her to the hospital after she tried to claw at her own arms, screaming that something was inside her reflection. Nurses restrained her as she repeated the phrase in the ancient dialect, her voice distorting unnaturally low, as though spoken by something far beyond her years. Doctors could not find a cause. No neurological damage, no toxins, nothing physically wrong with her. Yet she reacted violently when they tried to remove the mirror in her room, insisting she needed to keep watching it, because it moves when I don't. For the first time, medical professionals were forced to consider the unthinkable. The phenomenon behaved less like trauma and more like contagion. A psychological infection spreading from person to person, anchored not by physical contact but by awareness itself. Anyone who saw the figure. Anyone who heard the whisper. Anyone who learned the truth. They became vulnerable. The most chilling report came from a parent who had no involvement with the investigation at all. She hadn't seen the footage. She had not visited the school. She had only listened to her daughter's account. Yet that night, she dreamed of the hallway. She dreamed of the flickering light. She dreamed of the tall figure standing at the far end, slowly turning toward her. And when she woke, she had a nosebleed and deep scratches on her forearm, scratches she insisted were not self-inflicted. News of these incidents spread through the community like wildfire, turning fear into panic. Parents pulled their children from town. Some families moved away entirely. The school board attempted to release statements reassuring the public, but their words felt hollow compared to the growing number of reports. Whispers continued. Dreams worsened. Some investigators refused to return to the school. Others resigned entirely. But the most disturbing realization came when Crane analyzed the timelines. The haunting wasn't spreading randomly. It was spreading deliberately. Every new victim had either connected with a student, interacted with the investigators, or learned more about the orphanage. Knowledge itself was the catalyst. The whisper was not fading. It was multiplying. Growing stronger. Reaching further. And whatever was calling from the dark corners of Ravenswood, was no longer confined to the school that had awakened it. Dr. Howard Lorne's breakdown marked a turning point in the investigation. What had previously been dismissed as a linguistic curiosity, a strange, forgotten dialect whispered by terrified children, was now undeniably tied to something ancient, deliberate, and dangerously intelligent. The phrase the students repeated was not a random hallucination. It had structure, rhythm, and intent. And now, for the first time, investigators were about to learn what it meant. 2 days after Dr. Lorne was hospitalized for his episode, Detective Crane received a call from a different language expert, Professor Mira Ashford, a specialist in proto-regional dialects and dead languages. Her voice was steady yet strained, as if she were choosing every word with caution. "I've read Howard's notes," she said. "And I think he was right to be afraid." Crane's grip tightened around the phone. "What does the phrase mean?" "It's a plea," she replied. "A repeated request. Almost ritualistic." "Request for what?" There was a long pause. Crane imagined her sitting in her dim academic office, surrounded by ancient manuscripts, staring at a translation she wished she'd never uncovered. "It means, 'Let me in.'" The words hit Crane like a blow. He sat silently, the phrase echoing through his mind. Every child had heard it. Some whispered it in their sleep. Others repeated it unconsciously after waking from visions. And Ms. Callahan had followed its call into the basement, never returning. "It's not a threat," Professor Ashford continued softly. "It's an invocation. Something begging for entry. Not into a place but into people." Crane felt a coldness spread through him. Entry into what kind of people? Anyone who acknowledges it. Anyone who hears the phrase. Anyone who believes it exists. For the first time, Crane understood the scale of what they were dealing with. The contagion wasn't physical, it was cognitive. Awareness was the gateway. Knowledge spread the influence. The whisper was an invitation, and every frightened mind that heard it cracked the door open a little wider. Professor Ashford wasn't finished. "The phrase originates from a dialect spoken in small ritual communities from over a century ago. Most of those communities suffered mass disappearances or unexplained deaths. Legends say they were guarding something that tried to communicate through visions, dreams, whispers." "Guarding from what?" Crane asked. She exhaled shakily. "From a presence that could not cross into our world unless it was acknowledged. Unless a host let it in." Crane closed his eyes. The children. The parents. The investigators. They had all seen the drawings, the footage, the basement. They had all heard the whisper in some form. The figure had been calling them, choosing them, slowly tightening its grip through recognition. The next breakthrough came from an old town ledger Eleanor found, dated 1893, just before the orphanage collapse. It contained a series of interviews with surviving Hawthorne children. Most had been traumatized beyond speech, but one child had scribbled a shaky phrase across the interview page: "It wants a doorway." Another wrote, "It needs someone to see it first." And the clearest one of all, "It follows the ones who listen." Detective Crane felt a knot form in his stomach. He stood in the dim library-turned-investigation room, surrounded by the drawings found in both the school and the basement, each one depicting the faceless figure. The children hadn't just seen something. They had been participating in something they didn't understand, something designed to cross boundaries. Awareness was the ritual. Recognition was the offering. Fear was the invitation. Later that evening, an officer ran into the room, breathless. "We found Ms. Callahan," he stammered. Crane's heart jolted. "Where?" "In the basement. She's still alive." The entire team rushed toward the old staircase hidden below the library. Flashlights flickered across the stone walls as they descended. MS. Callahan was kneeling in the center of the chamber, facing the far wall, her back toward them. Her posture was rigid, her fingers digging into the dirt floor. Her head tilted slightly, as though listening to something they could not hear. Crane stepped forward cautiously. "Miss Callahan?" His voice echoed through the chamber. She didn't turn around. Instead, she inhaled sharply. Then, in a voice that didn't belong to her, she whispered the phrase with chilling clarity, each syllable pronounced flawlessly in the ancient dialect, "Let me in." Her voice was layered, two tones at once, one human, one impossibly deep. The air temperature plummeted. Breath became visible. A low hum vibrated through the stone walls as if the chamber itself were responding. Crane took another step. "Who's asking to be let in?" he asked, though he feared the answer. Ms. Callahan's shoulders twitched. Then her head slowly rotated, not fully, not naturally, but just enough for them to see the corner of her face. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't her eyes. They were completely black. A faint smile ghosted across her lips. "It already chose," she whispered. Then she collapsed. The paramedics carried her out, but she was unresponsive, breathing shallowly, her body ice cold. And the chilling detail, the one that haunted Crane most, was the way her hands remained tightly clenched. When they pried them open, her palms were covered in fresh scratches, forming the same pattern found on the basement walls. Not random scratches. Symbols. Invitations. That night, Crane and Professor Ashford reviewed the recordings of Ms. Callahan's whisper. Ashford paled visibly as she listened. "It's not just a plea anymore," she said quietly. "It's answering. The phrase is changing." She replayed the audio, isolating a secondary undertone. Hidden beneath the familiar chant was a new phrase, short, clipped, spoken so faintly it almost blended with the background hum. Ashford translated it, voice trembling. "It says, 'I am close.'" Crane felt the room tilt. The figure wasn't asking to be let in anymore. It was announcing its arrival. And the terrifying truth hung unspoken between them, whatever haunted Ravenswood had already found its entry point. Someone, maybe more than one person, had already opened the door. The decision to close Ravenswood Public School overnight was not the result of a single event, but the culmination of a growing terror that reached its breaking point just after sunset. By then, investigators, administrators, and even parents had begun to understand one horrifying truth: whatever haunted the school was no longer dormant, no longer contained, and no longer waiting. It was active. And it was escalating. The final incident began shortly after 7:40 p.m., when a security guard patrolling the East Wing radioed in a trembling report. He claimed he heard footsteps echoing behind him, light, quick, childlike. When he turned, he saw no one. But the footsteps continued, circling him in the empty hallway. His voice cracked through the radio as he added, "They're giggling. I swear I hear children laughing." The line cut out. When two officers rushed to find him, they discovered his flashlight spinning on the floor. Its beam shook violently, bouncing off the lockers. The guard was slumped against the wall, conscious but unresponsive, whispering the ancient phrase over and over again. Minutes later, the building itself seemed to react. Emergency lights flickered erratically. Doors slammed shut on their own. The HVAC system let out a groaning exhale that reverberated through every hallway like a living creature awakening from a long sleep. A low vibration hummed beneath the floors, causing dust to drift down from the ceiling tiles. In classroom 2A, the same room where several students first reported feeling watched, the desks began to move. Slowly at first, then violently. Investigators who entered found chairs shaking as though invisible hands were gripping them. One desk slid several feet across the room, leaving deep scrape marks in the tile. The air in that room dropped to freezing, causing frost to form around the windows. But the most terrifying discovery came from the central wing, where a loud thud echoed through the corridor. When investigators arrived, they saw that an entire section of the ceiling had collapsed. The debris scattered across the floor revealed something beneath the fallen plaster, tiny handprints imprinted in the dust. Dozens of them. All child-sized. All facing upward, as if reaching from beneath. That was the moment panic broke the last thread of rationality. Principal Reeves, normally stoic and controlled, demanded a full evacuation of all personnel. He ordered the doors locked and sealed until higher authorities could determine the next steps. "No one enters after tonight," he declared, "not until we know what we're dealing with." But the final horror waited in the principal's own office. When a pair of officers entered to retrieve emergency files, they found the room in disarray, papers scattered, furniture overturned. The window was fogged from the inside, streaked with long smears resembling fingertips. But what froze them in place was the figure captured on the office's interior camera feed. A tall silhouette stood behind Reeves's desk. Unmoving. Watching. So close that its blank face nearly touched the camera lens before the footage cut to static. By midnight, Ravenswood Public School was officially sealed. No one argued. No one protested. Everyone who stepped outside felt the same crushing realization settle over them: the school didn't shut down because of fear. It shut down because something inside had finally awakened, and it wasn't finished.